Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Chase. I am a senior consultant here with Improving and specializing in endpoint management, more or less, and everything SCCM, now known as Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager, and Intune, as it relates whether to Windows devices or mobile devices. Anybody who's attended some of the previous sessions that I've facilitated know that I try and spend a little bit more time on walkthroughs, and today will be no different. What we're going to kind of cover is more related to Windows 10 and managing that and why you would want to manage that using Intune or MEM. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So obviously, why would you want to enroll your Windows devices? The big three really in my mind are enhanced security, controlling compliance, and centralized control. Application delivery is a bonus to it, but Intune gives you the ability to control your devices and where that device is, how it can access the data, what data it can access, and where you can go as far as even to say, you know, if the device is in a certain location, it may not be allowed to access the device. So say your user goes ahead and signs on to a wireless network at Starbucks. If that wireless network is not something that's tagged as being safe, they may not be able to access their corporate data. Not saying they can't sign into the laptop, but they may not be able to access that precious Excel spreadsheet they're wanting to work on so badly. So that kind of protects your data, make sure that you don't have anybody who's doing some shoulder surfing and might catch something that you may not want them to catch. Obviously, application delivery helps you control your application lifecycle. So obviously you can deliver applications using Intune, but you can also specify compliance around those different applications and determine whether or not a user is able to access your data because they're maybe not using an application that you're deeming compliant. So maybe it's not the right version of the application, or maybe they're trying to access the data using a web browser that you don't want them to use. Controlling compliance is just that. You can designate whether or not a device is compliant based off of patching level or OS version, or does it have BitLocker enabled? Is it got Windows Defender running on it? Again, come back to, is it in the right location with conditional access, types of things like that. And then you can go ahead and say, well, if that device isn't compliant, what do I want to do with that device? Do I want to block it? Do I want to retire it? Do I want to just send a notification to the user to say, hey, guess what? Your device isn't compliant. Contact the help desk to have them assist you getting your device compliant. What I tend to do is a 3-strike rule for users. I usually first do a compliance alert for the help desk to let them know, hey, a device is non-compliant. And then usually within a certain time frame, then I send a notification to the user saying, hey, your device is not compliant, contact the help desk. If you haven't contacted the help desk within this period of time, you risk your device being locked, not being compliant, not being able to access the data you need to access. And then 3rd strike, hey, your device is still not compliant. We've locked your device. Contact the help desk. So that's kind of how I like to do it. And then your centralized control, well, that's just what it is. You're sitting in a situation where you don't have the need for additional on-premise infrastructure, and you can just use everything in the cloud. So your dashboards, your management console, all of that is within the cloud. And you don't have to worry about any of the on-premise infrastructure, or, you know, am I running out of storage? Am I at a situation where I have a failure point on my network. Now somebody can't access, they can't talk back to our primary site server in the case of you using SCCM or something like that. So that kind of gives you that ability to just, everything's in a one-stop shop. Everything's in the endpoint .microsoft.com site. And you can go ahead and sign in with your Azure AD creds and administer everything through there. So using Intune or MEM to control your devices, or when you enroll your devices, it's really a security focused solution. It gives you the ability to leverage items like BitLocker, Defender for Endpoint, which would be your antivirus and your endpoint detection and response. You can configure firewall policies. You can configure attack surface reduction, device compliance, conditional access, and Windows OS patching, which we will do a little thing. I'll show you where the OS patching is related to where that's at as part of the walkthrough. So again, the big thing here with the Intune piece with the Windows desktop is it gives you the ability to really focus on the security of the device and making sure that that device has all the components from a security perspective configured and enabled to make sure that the data that your users are accessing is secure. Just like if you're thinking about your mobile device management, similar process or similar thought process on it. Use app protection policies to protect your data to make sure data is not being compromised. Only certain applications can access said data, and then you control what happens with that data. Can it be copied out of the application and saved at another location? Can it only be accessed to OneDrive? Can it only be saved to OneDrive? What have you. Similar process, similar thought process, except there's a lot more in here that you can configure. So when you talk about, all right, so I want to enroll my Windows devices, what are the best practices for enrollment? Or what's best practices by enrollment method? And I put a link in the spreadsheet or in the presentation that takes you to this graph or this chart, and you can go ahead and click on any one of these items and it'll tell you the best practices for each one of those. The one that I tend to recommend to customers is the very last one. Reason being is obviously it gives you the most flexibility. Obviously you can't do DEM and you can't do bulk, but it's easier to enroll your devices. So you can do co-management if you're in an environment that has SCCM. Benefit of that is you can also set those devices when they go ahead and they sync between SCCM and Intune to auto-enroll them. GPO is just that. You configure a GPO that sets the enrollment policy on the device. BYOD is a little bit more manual. The user would have to go ahead and sign in their device. So just like if you join a device to the domain, it's a similar process, and it would be you can enroll the device and register the device, but you do not have to have it Azure AD joined at that point. It just needs to be registered and then you can enroll it. Azure AD with autopilot. Now, again, that's only for self-deploying mode. So you can't do a, Azure or autopilot deployment that's not a self-deployment. Fully Azure AD joined, not hybrid Azure AD joined, or Azure AD joined with autopilot user-driven mode does accept it as well. Now, something I want to point out here is it does say Azure AD joined. You can still do enrollment with a hybrid Azure AD joined environment. You would have to leverage a group policy portion of that as well. So you would have to configure the group policy to force the enrollment for a hybrid Azure AD joined device. So keep that in mind if you're a hybrid Azure AD office or organization, Keep in mind, if you want to do your enrollment, you would have to configure the GPO to do that. Any questions so far? All right. So, you know, what do you need, obviously, for Windows enrollment? Obviously, the biggest thing is your Intune licensing requirements. So you need to have, I believe, an E3 or E5, or one of the corresponding education or government licensing models. You can enroll Windows 8.1 devices, but what you'll find is if you roll Windows 8.1 devices, you're limited on what you can and cannot control with Windows 8.1. So the recommendation would be to use a supported version of Windows 10. You can use Windows 10, obviously, Pro for education and workstations, Enterprise, Education, and Enterprise 2019 LTSC. You can do Azure AD, and you can do hybrid Azure AD join devices. Those are the big things to keep in mind. I will go ahead and select the Intune licensing here, though, just to kind of show you what all's there. So here's your licensing requirements. Intune is included with the following licenses, obviously. E3, E5, EMS, E3, E5, M365 Business Premium, M365 F1, F3, M365 Government G5, G3, and Intune for Education. Keep in mind, Intune for Education, there's A3, A5 are the requirements when it comes to that. Any other questions or any questions at all? Okay. I kind of roll through these things kind of quick because I like to spend a little more time showing you some of the meat and potatoes of the solution. So we're going to talk about configuring auto enrollment, security baseline creations. So if we go backwards, and this is something I probably should have touched on real quick. When we talk about security, so when we talk about security, all of these items in here, other than Windows OS patching, and I believe conditional access, can be configured as part of what's known as a security baseline. So every one of these items could be configured and created and targeted individually to security groups that hold either devices or users, or you can create what's known as a security baseline with each one of these different policy sets configured, and then just deploy the security baseline to your security groups. So with that being said, let me get to my way too many tabs. Which one do I want to go with? Oh, it's not the lab I wanted to. I'm not quite sure if my lab is still, my license is still, but we'll see here in just a second. If not, I'll go into our improving tenant and show you. Oh, did not come up on there. So first thing we're going to talk about is I'm not going to discuss the enrollment part yet because I'll have to go under another location to do that for you. But what we're going to talk about is your endpoint security first. One of the things that I did, of course not. Let's go. So obviously here, one of the things that you'll notice is under endpoint security, up at the top, you have your security baselines, your antivirus, your disk encryption, firewall. So one thing to keep in mind, we talk Defender for Endpoint. Sure you guys did attend, hopefully some of you attended our Defender for Endpoint session. Defender for Endpoint can be configured in two different areas. Well, there's different settings based off of what you want to do. So obviously you can specify your antivirus policies, but you can also specify your detection and response. And then you can also specify your attack surface reduction. Then you actually have your disk encryption, which is BitLocker, firewall config policies. You can do account protection, device compliance, and conditional access. So what we're going to focus on is what's the security baseline. We have some out here already. Right now we have Microsoft Defender for Endpoint baseline. I am going to go through the process here. And obviously right here we have our baseline, and I'm just going to go through this one just to give you an idea of what we have out here. I'm not going to actually go through creating one. If you wanted to, right here you can go ahead and create a profile associated with the baseline. Within the properties, if you notice here, these are all the items that we currently have set. So you can do smart screen, you can do firewall, you can do DMA guard, device installation, different items underneath here. So you can block obviously devices by installation set by setup class, and you can set a block list. So if you have a device identifier that you want to block, if you don't want a specific device in here, you can put that device identifier in here. What I will do though is I actually will go ahead and create a profile for you guys. So I'm just going to go ahead and create it under this. I'm not going to save it. Give you guys an idea what it looks like, how to do it. Obviously, if you look here, there's a ton of things that you can set. So here's one thing if you want to do event log servicing, you can specify how big the event log will be, so it'll auto delete it. Well, let's focus on just the security stuff. Don't care about that. So if we were to go here and say we want to configure our BitLocker policy, removable. Now, mind you, this is only on the removable portion, okay? You would have to specify BitLocker separately for internal drives. So this will basically tell how that drive is going to, any removable drive gets put into a device, it's going to basically tell you what they can and cannot do with it. You can go as far as connectivity. So if you wanted to block things like blocking downloading print drivers or internet downloads from web publishing and online ordering wizards, things like that, you can do that. Data protection is the one that really kind of, I think, is more important. So you're going to want to go ahead and block direct memory access. And if anyone is familiar with Intune, Obviously, if you have any questions about something you're looking at setting, hover over the little exclamation point, and it will give you an explanation of what it is you're looking at. And handy dandy little link there. If you want to learn more, go out there and it'll tell you anything you need to know about that setting. So if we were to go out here and I was look at this here, it'll tell me what it can and cannot do. So it's supported on Pro, Business, Enterprise Education, tells you the scope. And obviously this one is not recommended for use in Windows 10. So that has changed. Device guard. We can discuss about virtualization-based security, launch your system guard, turn on credential guard. You can go as far as to configure your firewall policies. There is a lot here that you can configure. Once you've done everything you wanted to configure, you obviously would next. So if we went ahead and said next, obviously you can specify your scope tags. Because anybody, let's talk about tags here for a minute. Who on the call is familiar with tags and why you would want to use them? Can anybody tell me?
I think they could be used for certain machines that have different tags. You can have different functionality. You can build conditions around those tags.
You can. You can use those tags, one, to build, like if you wanted to build dynamic security groups, you could use tags for those. You can use tags for organizational purposes. So if you wanted to, say, create a tag for all development, say resource groups, or excuse me, resources within that group, or security groups, or accounts, or what have you, you can tag those. Then you can actually go a little bit further and say you wanted to pull up an inventory of everything that was of a certain tag, that has a certain tag associated with it. You could actually create reports to basically pull in all the data associated. So you would pull in everything that would be associated with, like, say, if you had a development tag, you can pull in everything associated with the development tag, and then more or less take inventory of what you've done and what you haven't done. So that's one of the things you can do tags with. Obviously, you can still use them for for dynamic group creation as well. So if you assign tags to certain items, you could go ahead and say you had a security group that was, I don't know, Power BI admins or report writers, and you wanted to assign through a script all the users in a specific OU to the security group that was tagged for Power BI report writers. You could go ahead and create a dynamic group that would populate based off of that. So there's a lot of flexibility with tags. A lot of people don't use them. I do recommend, if you are creating something, create a scope tag to go with it. It'll only help you in the long run. It'll help you organize your items, and it'll help you be able to stay in the know of what you've done and what you haven't done.
It's really easier to manage, is what you're saying. It's almost like AD attributes entering some specific information pertaining to the AD object, possibly, let's say, for instance, if they belong to a marketing group or something like that, you kind of group those together based on, you know, the specific information in the attribute.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at it as AD attributes. What I do tell people sometimes is, because believe it or not, and some people don't still understand attributes very well. So I say, okay, how do you organize your groups and your devices and all that stuff today? Oh, I use OUs. Well, kind of think of it like an OU. It's not a physical container, but it's an association of like items. So it really helps you out a little bit. So you tag it, it's an association. Everything that has the same tag, it's associated in some way, shape, or form. Then obviously you can go ahead and do your groups. Once you do your assignment, you can obviously, just like anything else in Intune, you can add your groups. You can add all users. You can add all devices. You can scope these policies or these profiles to users or devices. Okay, it's not a one or the other. If a user signs into a device that's scoped, that device is going to apply the policy unless that user is a member of an excluded group, if that makes sense. So if Jane Doe is an excluded group, in an excluded group here that says don't apply this policy to it, she signs into my device, say, which is a member of a group that's having this policy assigned to it. When she signs into it, this policy won't apply because she's a member of an excluded group.
Hey, Ken.
Yeah.
Question. Maybe you could explain a little bit more when it's best to use a user assignment versus a device assignment, or there are certain conditions or scenarios where you want to use one or the other, or does it not matter?
It really doesn't matter. It's really more or less your preference. My rule of thumb usually is I do device assignments when they are general purpose machines. So if they're multi-use machines, like I'm going to go ahead and say it's a kiosk, or it's a machine that's sitting at a, say it's a machine shop and you've got one PC sitting in the middle of the machine shop that everybody's going ahead and logging tickets against. So, if you ever worked at a manufacturing company, sometimes you have out on the floor, they might have part orders. So they go rate their parts, and then they take their tag over and they input the information if they don't have like a Knox device that they scan the tags with, or a warehouse for say for example, you go to a warehouse, your tow motor driver is told to go pull 6 pallets from, aisle 6, bay 9, and aisle 7, bay 2, aisle 7, bay 4, and he has to come back with all the tags off the pallets and input that information in the system. To me, you may not have any users assigned to that into Intune for that case, but you have a general use device that's signing in with a service account. So you want, or maybe you got a supervisor that's signing into it, start the day, and everybody just goes and logs their information. In those scenarios, do device policies. If you want to make sure that specific users always get a specific security set, do user policies. So, for example, maybe you have a CFO and you want to make sure that his data is never compromised, no matter what device he signs into. Make sure that you assign a policy to a group that has him in it. That way, if Joe goes into Starbucks and you don't want Joe accessing, financial data at Starbucks because you don't want those shoulder surfers walking by, then Joe needs to be in a group that's targeted with a profile that's saying, hey, don't allow him to be able to sign in from this zone, or don't allow him to be able to access this data from this zone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks. I just thought it would be good to kind of give a distinction between one is better to use one or the other.
Yeah, I mean, it's really comes down to what your company's security. So whatever your company's security, appetite is, You know, if they say they want to be a NIST shop or some sort of CIS level shop that they want to make sure they're adhering to certain standards, then you're going to have to basically build your policies, your profiles based off of that mentality or that thought process. But what I usually recommend is if it's a kiosk type machine or if a general purpose type machine that everyone is signing into or multiple people are signing into, and it doesn't have any real security implications or light security implications, use a device profile, scope it to a device, otherwise scope to user. I also recommend the same thing from an MDM perspective. So if you're doing iOS, you wouldn't necessarily scope your app protection policies to the device. You want to scope them to the user, because what happens if that user trades in a device, they no longer have the device that's scoped to. So when they get a new device, they're not going to get any policy sets. They may get, you know, bare minimum app protection if you've done it right. But you're better off saying, I'm going to scope my compliance policies, all this to a user, because no matter what device the user gets, it's going to apply to them.
Hey, Ken, quick question for you. What happens if you, or I should say, is it allowed to have an overlap? So could you have like a very base policy, so everything in the environment gets this, and then have like a step up, or do you need to have those no overlap?
You can have step ups, but it's just like everything else. With Microsoft, it's least privileged wins. Except in the case where I was talking about an exclusions on this. So if you explicitly do an exclusion on a policy, then it's not a least privilege wins. It's okay, this policy doesn't apply at all. So you have to be careful about your overlap. So take into consideration, if you set a policy that's a base, and say you set a compliance setting of the device has to be iOS. Let's just talk about, or let's go Windows, since we're talking about Windows. Say it's got to be at least Windows 10 1909. But then you set another policy, or say you say 1809, then you set another policy that says, well, now it has to be 1909. You've got a conflict. So what I would recommend is, if you're going to do step ups, your policies that are step ups shouldn't contain the data that's in the policies that are below. You should start out as strict as you want to be at the base, and then go from there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so they're additive. There's no real overlap in the settings. You don't have competing settings.
Yeah, because if you have overlap, you have run the risk of having conflict. And you also have the risk of, depending on when that policy gets refreshed. So you could have a potential policy, just like group policy. So remember, with group policy, a lot of times you could have overlap, but depending on when that group policy refreshed or one failed and they had similar settings in them, you would kind of like flip-flop between configs. You would have the same problem with this. So if my device checks in and for some reason the profile that I've configured or the policy I configured didn't get validated, but another one did, it could potentially overwrite the other. So you're having an issue with desired state.
So would your recommendation be to have discrete policies only, and not really have like step ups or additive policies in the environment?
I would not recommend step ups. I would recommend having specific policies for specific functions and features. So if you want to control security, make sure so for example, your security baseline, should have just security settings in it. Now, some people may think that security settings, okay, well, I think that's security and you don't. For example, if we went into one of these, let me go back into this. So, you know, I may not think autoplay is a security setting. Somebody else may. You know, I don't really consider that security. But somebody else may go, well, I don't want an application just running at startup. Well, all right, cool. That's a preference in my mind. That's not a security thing, unless it's specifically outlined within CIS or NIST, which I don't believe it is. You know, to me, things that are security, specifically security, your browser, your BitLocker, your connectivity, credential delegation, credential UI, data protection, device guide or guard, device lock, things like those. Those are security. Get into something like experience. Is that really security? Windows Spotlight? No, don't put it in your security profile. Have your profiles be specific to the need. That way, what happens is if I have to make any adjustments to my security settings, I'm doing a security profile. I'm not going into a security profile that has a bunch of, you know, I don't want to say that, I'll just say the word garbage. Have a bunch of garbage in it that's not related to security. Because then you're at risk of overlap. I mean, I don't know how many, just for example, when you guys think of group policy, in your current environments, if you look at group policy, think about how many group policies you probably have. I know for my experience and from a lot of others here, you know, we go into organizations and sometimes there'll be hundreds of group policies. And those group policies, some of them will have one setting configured in them. Now think to yourself, when you think about how group policy applies, is that the most efficient way for you to manage group policy, especially as it applies to a workstation? Group policy will affect your login times. It'll affect performance of a device. You know, there's a lot of negative effects it can have on a device if group policy is not configured and scoped properly. Similar thing with security baselines and any policy within SC or within MEM. It can have some very negative effects on how your device is functioning and how it's being secured. So we kind of went over security baselines a little bit. Kind of wanted to show you guys where Windows updates are. Windows updates, to me, are a very important thing because patch management is what helps you maintain compliance from a security standpoint. Intune gives you the ability to do Windows 10 update rings. You can actually create an update profile for a device. And specify what is it you want to do. So if I want to do semi-channel targeted, 18.9 and above, insider, slow, release preview, whatever I want to do there. I can specify, I can go Microsoft product updates, drivers, I can say yes to both if I wanted to. If I don't care about Windows drivers, block them. Check update deferral period. You can set all this stuff. What this does then is it basically sets your Windows updates settings on that device and says what it can and cannot do. And it will go ahead and download the the updates from Microsoft updates, as opposed to you having to create packages and SCCM and so on and so forth. It will maintain the fact that your device is going to stay up to date as it relates to Windows updates. Now, obviously, this isn't going to help you if you're worried about Adobe Acrobat updates or Flash or Java or whatever name, put, you know, nebulous third-party product that you may be using. Maybe you're doing SolidWorks and you want to update SolidWorks, okay, or Crystal Reports. That's obviously not going to help that, but it will keep you up to date as it relates to Windows and the Microsoft products that are on it. So that's the thing to take into mind, take into consideration. This is one of the big things I think a lot of people kind of overlook, is keeping their devices up to date from a patch management standpoint. Something I wanted, since we touched on group policy briefly, something I want to talk to you about. If you go the route of co-management, going to help you a little bit. This little new feature, it's in preview, is group policy analytics. What this will do is it'll review the group policies associated with devices. And it'll basically look out there and tell you what group policies may be a problem. You can also look at, well, we're not going to worry about this because this is something we're going to cover later on. So you can create device cleanup rules and things like that. Those are all things we'll discuss in later sessions. So how is it you manage enrollment? Now let me go ahead and, sorry guys, I got Windows 11 on my device and I'm still trying to remember how. To get into my lab. Part of the problem with being an early adopter on things. If anybody's familiar with comic books, obviously I'm a X-Men geek. So in my environment, in my lab, I actually have configured co-management because it's my preferred method. For connecting or for enrolling devices, Windows devices. Keep in mind, guys, when I say enrolling Windows devices, I'm talking about Windows Client OS devices. All these features I'm talking about right now, except for like Defender for Endpoint and BitLocker, are not supported for server OS. It is all client OS, so Windows 10, soon to be Windows 11 as well, but not Windows Server. So what I'm going to cover really is I'll go over the co-management piece. Because I'm going to make the assumption that many of you probably have Config Manager in your environment. If not, there is documentation that we can share with you from Microsoft on setting up the enrollment policies. So for setting up co-management, it's very simple. It is literally configure co-management. Obviously, I already have mine configured, but as part of the configuration process, so I can go ahead and I can just say here, select what I want to be enrolled or uploaded. Once I enroll them, I can do auto enrollment. I do auto enrollment on all my devices. Or you can do pilot or you can do none. So if I were to say I wanted to do pilot, I would have to select a collection of devices that I wanted to enroll. I want all. Then I can control what workloads are there. And I think we've covered this in previous sessions. I kind of went over some of this stuff with you. Same premise. Still today. Let me see if I can. Oh, flibbity flu. And if we were to go to, I do not have. So for auto enrollment, you can configure it also within Azure AD. And it is under mobility and MDM, Microsoft Intune. I don't have one anymore, but this is where you would configure it at. I let my license expire for my lab. But yeah, you would configure it under your Azure AD, mobility, MDM, and MAM. And then from within there, you basically would specify how you want those devices to be enrolled. Do you want everything to be enrolled that is Azure AD joined, or do you only want a subset of devices to be enrolled? And you can scope it to security groups just the same way if you wanted to. With that being said, I'm going to go back to the presentation here. And if you want, we can take some questions.
Doesn't appear to be any questions in the chat, but I encourage anyone to come off mute and ask any questions they may have. If you're thinking of questions, let me go ahead and just look at or review the slide that Ken does have up. This is our 8th installment of, oops, just went past our schedule there, our 8th installment of our 2021 webinar series. The overall goal of that series was to help you develop your endpoint management strategy from start to finish. So we'll be continuing that in September with our 9th installment. That is going to be looking at Windows as a service, and our Christian Ball from our team will be diving into that presentation. So I hope everyone is going to be in attendance for that one. If not, please take a look at our CSP website, reference there, improving.com, services cloud solution provider, to register for that session. All the recordings of our previous webinar sessions are also available at that link. So if you want to catch up on anything that you may have missed, feel free to take a look. I still don't see any questions in the chat, so I guess we'll stick around for a little bit longer, but Ken, if there's nothing else on your end, anything else that you wanted to cover, we'll go ahead and wrap up here. But as I said, we'll stay on if anyone does want to come off mute after we stop the recording to ask any questions. I appreciate everyone's attendance today.